Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for, as I said, joining on a cold and dark Wednesday evening. My name is Bea Ginieri, and I'll be sort of facilitating this conversation today. And as you may know, we are Just Stop Oil. This is a talk hosted by Just Stop Oil. For those who are new, Just Stop Oil, we're a group of ordinary people in civil resistance against the UK government, and we're demanding an end to new oil and gas. In the face of recent tragedies and violence and genocide in the world and the increase in climate catastrophe, our government still remains complicit and complacent despite impending climate and social collapse, and insists on a corrupt relationship with the fossil fuel industry. Tonight, our talk is on intergenerational justice and what it really means, and we'll be joined by the excellent Jonathon Porritt. Tonight, when we're exploring intergenerational justice and what it really is, what we're referring to is intergenerational responsibility. It's about the unification of generations and the bonds between each generation and what we owe to each other. For me, I have learned a great deal looking to the generations within my family and those that I care for. My uncle in Nigeria, he's a chief in the village and in the tribe that I'm a part of, and teaches us greatly about the respect of the land and seeing ourselves as stewards on this planet to protect it and to protect the people. Yet the way things are currently going, when I think about the future and I look at my generation and my 10-year-old cousins, and I look at the amazing comrades of people I stand with in social justice, I see a very scary and difficult life ahead. The decisions will have been made by previous generations. So what's it going to be? A future where we can live with dignity, or one where civil unrest and social collapse is rife because people no longer have their basic needs? My homelands of Nigeria and Armenia are already being devastated by climate collapse and conflicts, corrupt governments, soulless corporations, and heartless fossil fuel companies who disregard human life. So I really have a passion to fight for this. But more than that, I am a human and I have a responsibility, a duty to fight for a livable, just future. Tonight, we're going to look at this topic from a few angles. And first, we have our amazing special guest, Jonathon Porritt, who is going to talk and deepen the discussion a bit around intergenerational justice. If you have a question for Jonathon, then please submit it via the Q&A function, and we'll hopefully have some time to discuss a couple of them. Then we have Alex, who's going to really ground us in the Just Stop Oil campaign, the strategy of Just Stop Oil, a background of the campaign and why we're doing what we're doing, which is really rooted in intergenerational responsibility. And finally, we'll hear a personal testimony from the amazing Rebecca, who's been taking action with Just Stop Oil. We are recording this talk. Only the speakers will be seen in the recording, and the talk will be uploaded to our YouTube very soon. The talks will last about an hour, but if you can please stay until the end, because a poll with the ways to get involved in the campaign will be released. It will just take a second to do the different ways to get involved: donating, volunteering, marching, joining a non-violence training. And that will then be followed by breakout rooms where you can join one of our facilitators to debrief how you feel and discuss the talk and the actions you can take further. And that will be about 20 minutes. But it's important maybe just to note first that this can be a hard topic and can be quite emotional. So we will share some support resources in the chat for you. The Just Stop Oil Coalition have an amazing offering through our Resilience to Resist team, and the full offering we'll give you in the chat. And support on issues related to activism and the law is also available by contacting the Climate Action Support Pathways Hotline, and we'll provide that number as well. So without further ado, first we have a very special guest, Jonathon Porritt, who is a writer and campaigner on sustainable development. For the last 30 years, Jonathon has provided strategic advice to the leading UK and international companies to deepen their understanding of today's converging environmental and climate crisis. It really focuses on intergenerational justice. Jonathon is president of the Conservation Volunteers and is involved in the work of many other NGOs and groups. In 1996, he co-founded Forum for the Future, a leading international sustainable development charity, working with business and civil society to escalate the shift towards a sustainable future. Jonathon was formerly co-chair of the Green Party between 1980 and 1983, and director of Friends of the Earth from 1984 to 1990. He stood down as chair of the UK Sustainable Development Commission in 2009 after 9 years, and served a 10-year term as Chancellor of Keele University from 2012 to 2022. His latest book, Hope in Hell, is a really powerful call to action on the climate emergency. And remember, if you have a question for Jonathon, please submit it via the Q&A function. So it's a pleasure to pass over to you, Jonathon.
Thank you very much indeed. And yeah, I'm delighted to be joining you all this evening. It's quite a special moment for me in a way, in that it marks a bit of a moment in my life where I've spent the last 30 years trying to work with business and politicians and others who would call themselves decision makers, and come to the conclusion that that's really not doing what we needed to do. And I find myself in a very different place now, which is interesting for me, a bit unsettling, the truth be told, but interesting. So a tiny bit of personal history, if I may, first, because it sort of matters to me that most of my life has been spent trying to make sense of this concept of sustainable development. And when the notion of sustainable development was first put out there in the public domain through the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, back in 1987, it stirred up a huge amount of interest. It really did. It seems almost impossible to believe that there was that level of focus on it. And that's because it used this terminology around sustainable development, which is very clear, that says sustainable development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations. That's it. Remarkably simple. But of course, buried in that is an extraordinary commitment, which is that the way we meet our needs today, us, the present generations, must not diminish the prospects for future generations, because if it does that, it's not sustainable. It's unsustainable development. And this, for me, it came out in 1987, was a really important moment, because I'd become director of Friends of the Earth in 1984. I'd struggled a bit, to be honest, in terms of the difficulty that a lot of environmentalists had in those days to understand a social justice commitment. Again, it may seem odd to people listening to this now, but back at that time, people who did social justice, development work, whatever, poverty-related issues and so on, they were in that particular area, and people who did environment stuff were in the green box over here, and they didn't really talk about social justice because they didn't feel there was any connection going on between the two. And it was astonishing and ridiculous, completely ridiculous. And it drove me absolutely mad in the Green Party that we couldn't break through some of that. And then it drove me even madder in Friends of the Earth, because we were sitting on so many issues that needed as much of a social justice lens as an environmental stroke climate lens. So when the Brundtland report turned up in my life in 1987, I thought, oh God, fantastic. It's going to be different now. People are going to see that you can't separate these two things out. There's no solution to any of these problems, environmental problems, without dealing with the social issues. And there's no solution to the social issues unless we get on top of the continuing massive damage we were doing to the planet, even then back in 1987. So from that point on, for me, it's been perfectly clear that we have to keep this dual focus running throughout our lives, because if you don't keep the two things present in people's minds at the same time, you do end up with very narrow reductionist thinking, both from a social point of view and an environmental point of view. So there was a lot of promise in 1987. I suppose you could say eventually, after the various iterations that went on before, it led to the Sustainable Development Goals back in 2015. But in the meantime, sustainable development was not really the powerhouse of thinking and action and different ways of accepting our responsibility on this planet as it should have been. And it was a very hard slog. It really was a very hard slog indeed. Again, it's peculiar to think about this, but back in 1987, had you suggested, for instance, that it would be possible to provide the wherewithal for an economy built entirely on renewable energy, not just renewable electricity, but renewable energy, so meeting the totality of human needs for different forms of energy. In 87, 1992, you would have been, honestly, dismissed out of 10. We were regularly, all the time, dismissed out of 10. Not possible. It's just you're dreamers, you're idealists. It's never going to happen like that. Well, of course, now the amazing thing is we live in a world where that is a total, obvious reality to be delivered in the shortest possible period of time. So the latest academic thinking on this is that we could almost certainly get to a near net zero world, not just by 2050, but by 2040. All the technology is there that we need already, and that technology will go on improving all the time. So the renewables today, not on their own, because they can't do what we need renewables to do on their own, but the storage side of things is being transformed all the time. Long-term storage, battery technology, emphasis on efficiency. One of the most disgraceful things about this current government, and there are so many, I must remind myself not to obsess about that tonight, but one of the most disgraceful things is their total dismissal of energy efficiency in the built environment in particular as the foundation for everything else that we need to do. It is cruel as well, because it impacts mostly on those already living in fuel poverty. So put that basket of things together: renewable storage, efficiency, smart grids, different ways of doing all of that. And over the next 20 years, there is literally no question whatsoever that we could get to a really good world underpinned by that kind of energy system for all 8 billion of us living on the planet today. Sorting out land use, food, farming, that's a little bit more complicated, especially as people are more reluctant to get involved in that stuff. But let's start with what the doable bit of this really is. And that almost, I don't know how to describe it really, but this incredible reluctance to accept that this is a deliverable world. It can be done. It's there for us to do if we want. It just drives people crazy. If it wasn't doable, well, we'd have to think differently about it. But it is completely doable. So that brings me to a rather different reality today. I'm not even going to bother to go over the history of so many failed conferences of the parties, the annual end of year jamboree where people get together to try and move the needle forward. It hardly ever moves forward. You'll probably recall that the Glasgow conference of the party 2 years ago was the first time since the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed off in 1992. It was the first time that the role of fossil fuels in accelerating climate change have been properly addressed. And then, of course, it wasn't really. It got kicked into the long grass again. But for decades, this was simply sidelined as if it wasn't the single most important thing that we have to actually deal with. I see these as 30 wasted years. I see the lack of leadership in the meantime from politicians and businesses and investors during that time as a total dereliction of duty from an intergenerational perspective. It's those 30 years that have put us in the mess we're in now. It is almost impossible to explain this, but 50%, half of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere today have been emitted in those 30 years. Just imagine if we'd got going 30 years ago. So that weighs heavily upon me, as you can imagine. And there have been many times in my life where I've seen the work that I do as a failure, just simply not managing to shift the agenda, move the needle with any of the people I was working with. And this is particularly true when you think about the role of big business and in particular big oil in our lives today. Astonishing piece of work published last week showing that out of the top 20 countries responsible for producing oil and gas, every single one of them is still planning to expand the investments they make in oil and gas. Every single one, including the UK, obviously, we know about that. But none of them are listening to the advice of the scientists. None of them are listening to the advice of the International Energy Agency, which has been categorical in saying that there is no viable future for humankind if we continue to invest in new oil and gas assets. And of course, this is one of the things I love about Just Stop Oil. It isn't asking for a nirvana. It isn't trying to sort out every single issue associated with climate change. It is simply saying there's one thing that has to happen first. And that thing is there must be no new investments in oil and gas, let alone coal assets. Everything depends on making that happen. So the hypocrisy, it's a polite word, actually, the corruption at the heart of governments today in their dealings with the oil and gas industry is extraordinary. And I invite you all to just think about the implications of that. So top of this list of the 20 countries most responsible for further expansion in oil and gas is the United Arab Emirates, Dubai and Abu Dhabi in particular. And guess which country tops that list? It's Abu Dhabi. Guess where COP28 is going to be? In Dubai, a part of the UAE. It's impossible to make this work. The whole UN FFFC has been taken over by the oil and gas industry, I'm sorry to say. So that's where we are now. And it's disconcerting is the wrong word to use. It's actually so demoralizing in terms of thinking what we now need to do. And I'm not going to bang on about the science for all of this evening, because I suspect that most people on this call are perfectly familiar with what the science tells us and just how dreadful a year 2023 has been and how dreadful a year 2024 is going to be because of the El Nino effect and so on. But there is an extraordinary thing happening now. The whole Glasgow conference 2 years ago was all pinned around this notion of keep 1.5 degrees centigrade alive, the idea that we must not exceed an average temperature increase of more than 1.5 degrees centigrade. Well, we've exceeded it. Now, happily, only on a temporary basis, but right now, the temperature of the planet is 1.5 degrees centigrade warmer than it was at the start of the Industrial Revolution. So we haven't kept it alive, we've killed it stone dead in the last 2 years. That target, it's gone, it's gone. And that's not an easy thing to say because it just makes our job that much harder. And that is why I think Just Stop Oil is right to go on saying to people you can't be a bystander any longer. You need to understand that this stuff is moving incredibly fast. The level of damage already being done is almost unimaginable from the human perspective, let alone the financial perspective, as it impacts on different industries all around the world. You can't go on being a bystander. You have to take sides. Now, that is, for a lot of people, very confrontational. And the majority of people out there would almost certainly prefer not to be forced to make that decision. Are you a bystander until such time as the roof on your own house falls in or a loved one is killed in a storm or whatever? Will you stand by until you get a personal reminder of that kind that causes massive grief in your life? Or will you be an upstander? Will you actually come forward now, not necessarily by taking up Just Stop Oil's cause, but will you come forward and do what you know needs to be done to help address this horrendous gap between what the science tells us and what the politicians are doing? And that, in reality, takes me back to the whole concept of intergenerational justice, because if there weren't already enough reasons to move the dial on this story about accelerated decarbonization, the final reason would surely be the impact that this is going to have on future generations. And the blog that I did for Just Stop Oil, I tried to put myself in the place of a young, concerned person today, 18, even younger, perhaps, but 18, 20, 25, whatever it might be, and see what it feels like to be on the receiving end of all of this information and all of these increasingly horrendous stories about climate impacts, to be on the receiving end of that and think to yourself, that is the whole of the rest of my life. There's no let up here. What starts now for me at 18 is with me and all my loved ones and everything and everybody I'll be with in the future. It'll be with me until the day I die. And when you look at it through that lens, and maybe I've been fortunate, I spent 10 years as a teacher doing English and drama. We spent a lot of time trying to get people out of their own space into the space of other people and trying to see the world differently. But when you think about it through that lens, what is happening now through this generation of politicians' abysmal failure is the most horrendous thing to contemplate for young people. So that's the very essence of intergenerational injustice. Literally nothing could be more cruel, less caring about the interests of future generations than what we're doing around climate change. I'm not going to go into the whole story about biodiversity and the unraveling of the natural world and the latest data that came out just 2 weeks ago that shows that it's not 1 million species that are at risk of extinction today, but actually it's closer to 2 million species at risk of extinction because of the way we conduct our economies today. So this whole story about intergenerational justice now is where I find myself. I need to use the benefit of 50 years of involvement in this movement. I joined the Green Party in 1974, and obviously I've tried pretty much everything that I possibly could to ensure that we didn't end up in the world we've ended up in today. So I want to turn that experience to a good use for as long as I possibly can. And that certainly means more involvement in politics. Labour will be better on this stuff than the Conservative government, but trust me, they're not going to be that much better. An election of a Labour government does not mean to say that everybody in Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion or any other organisation can stand down and say, "Whew, sorted, okay. Now we've got a government that really gets this stuff." No. That's not going to happen. because all of these parties today are still steeped in the politics of what it is to extract raw material from the earth, convert it into the things that we need, spew it out into the natural environment, to the massive detriment of people alive today and people in the future. So that's the story of intergenerational justice. It does not mean to say that I am any the less passionate about what is referred to as intragenerational justice, what we need to do to sort out injustice in our generation today. And the latest Joseph Rowntree report on that, which came out 3 weeks ago, just reminded us of how utterly unbelievable a situation we've got ourselves into. 3.8 million adults in the UK living, and this is their terminology, in destitution, including 1 million children. 1 million children living in extreme poverty in one of the world's wealthiest nations. So we have to get the balance right between intra-generational justice and intergenerational justice. They're two sides of the same coin that ought to inform all of the work that we actually do. So when Just Stop Oil challenges and says, you've got to take sides, yeah, dead right. We have all now got to take sides. There's nowhere to hide in that regard. You may think you're letting yourselves off by not taking some of those decisions, but you're not really. So that's my challenge now. I think it's probably everybody's challenge in my generation. And I believe it'll be the biggest test of our generation in the years to come. So Bear, I'll leave it there. I could probably ramble on all evening, but I'll stop there and hopefully we can get a bit of discussion going around that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Could have listened to you for ages. It's really, really fascinating. I really like how you talk of the importance of a dual focus, right? Intersecting. Otherwise, does lead to a really reductionist and ununified movement. So really interesting points. There's been so many questions coming through, which has been wonderfully overwhelming. And some with quite a similar theme. So I'm just going to sort through a couple of them from the audience. So there was a lot of questions about how we deconstruct and try to take away, I guess, power from fossil fuel companies. And Chris Pilput asks, how do you overcome the power of corporations who are in bed with government and keeping the fossil fuel economy going? So how do we as regular people, how do we overcome that?
Yeah. Oh wow. So in the interest of transparency, my organization, Forum for the Future, 10 years ago, we were working with both Shell and BP on the assumption that these companies had indicated they wanted to change. They wanted to become integrated energy companies, not pure play hydrocarbon companies. They were making all the right noises, and some of them inside those companies genuinely meant it. Most didn't, as we now know, but some of them did. And I personally was very involved in that work. So I spent the best part of 8 years working with senior executives in both BP and Shell. And eventually we pulled out because we came to the conclusion these people were lying. That's all one can say in retrospect. And an organization like mine was being made a fool of, in all honesty. It was a very difficult thing for us to deal with, because we thought that it would still be possible in those days to move these companies into a much more intelligent place, if not a completely fossil fuel free place. That was not in our ambition level at that time. So I've seen what these companies are like now, and I can see how the corruption and the venality informs all of them so deeply that I don't think they're free agents any longer themselves. Their investors will punish them, as they did when they tried to move towards being integrated energy companies. So how do we deal with that? Okay, I mean, my story is perhaps not very glamorous here, but two things are happening. One, in market terms, these companies are running out of competitive space in different markets. I mean, the energy alternative I was talking about, the renewable storage, efficiencies, smart grids, etc., in pretty much country after country now outcompetes hydrocarbon investments. So the only reason those hydrocarbon investments, oil and gas investments, continue is because governments actually subsidize them to make it possible for them to go on doing that. If we had operating markets, they'd be collapsing under the weight of their own incompetence. And the second thing is, and I do think this is going to make a difference, I think everybody now accepts that the oil companies are today's tobacco companies. I know we've talked about this for a long time, but we know now that companies like ExxonMobil knew everything there was to know about climate change back in the late 1970s and 1980s. And those class actions being brought against those oil companies will move through the courts now faster than they've done before. And I think we will see those companies brought to justice and hopefully even as a consequence found guilty of having caused this massive threat to the future of humankind. But the real answer there, obviously, is we have to go on campaigning against them and everybody who invests in them and the insurance companies that make it possible for them to go on doing their heinous business. And I think you may know, Bear, that's what I feel Just Stop Oil needs to do more of, is directly attacking the oil and gas companies, their investors, their publicists, their lawyers, their insurance companies. There's a whole vast array of economic interests in this and every other oil and gas producing country who depend on this machine. And the machine has to be dismantled. And the only way now is to make sure that that machine understands the criminality of what it's involved in and the consequences if they don't desist from the continued course of action they're on at the moment. So that's a big one for all of us, at whatever level of protest we may find ourselves.
Thank you, Jonathan. I guess in line with that, with talking about protests and I guess civil resistance, really, there was quite a lot of people who were asking and maybe a bit on the fence or a bit concerned about protesting, about marches. There's one comment by Kim, who joined the Green Party in the 80s, actually, after hearing you speak, and who's asking about protests and whether these will make a difference. So I suppose a question, just to build on what you've just said a bit, Jonathan, is why is the act of civil resistance, protest in whatever form, why is it such a powerful and important method for change?
I've always supported nonviolent direct action throughout my life as a sustainability activist. And when I was in Friends of the Earth, we were involved in a large number of nonviolent direct action campaigns. I've always seen it as a really important part of the total range of actions and interventions we can make to stop bad things happening, because you need that element. And sometimes it succeeds, as we know. Historically, sometimes it really can be very successful. But the reason why it now is, I think, an increasingly important part of the total mix is that we have a corrupt set of relationships between government and fossil fuel companies. That means they're acting in an extrajudicial way. In effect, they themselves are acting outside of the law. If you think the law of any land and any country should be, the primacy of that legal system should be to protect the interests of its citizens today, and if you're lucky, protect the interests of its citizens tomorrow, then clearly what governments and the oil and gas sector is doing today is extrajudicial. They're going beyond what their primary remit should be at any one time. I believe they have de facto become the criminals in the system. So at that point, it seems not only legitimate, but important that civil disobedience continues to make the case for a very different way of thinking about energy and wealth creation and wealth distribution and so on, because practically everything else has failed to move the system into an even halfway sensible position. So that's where I find myself now. I'm conflicted in this. I guess I'm still working full time. I would find it very difficult at the moment to end up arrested and imprisoned before I'm finished with that work, which will be finished completely at the end of this year. I'm happy to say. So I go through the same soul searching about what is the right thing for me to do as everybody else. Well, not everybody else. A lot of people have made these decisions for themselves and are showing us exactly what that kind of courage looks like in the face of the oppression of a police state. And I'm sorry to have to say this to people on this call who haven't spotted it, but we have become a police state under this Tory government. And that's what my JSO, my Just Stop Oil blog was about, was to remind people that we don't any longer have access to those freedoms that we once had. They've been progressively taken away from us. So I'm not in a different position at all from a lot of people who are feeling these uncertainties and how best they can interpret their own responsibilities at this time. I'm exactly in that place myself.
Thank you. Thank you, for hearing that as well. And just to reiterate that, civil disobedience and civil resistance has always been a very powerful, effective tool for change. It's always led to change. It's the fights of movements throughout history who have resisted laws and resisted governments that have led to change. And we at Just Stop Oil, we take great inspiration from those who have gone before us, the suffrage, civil rights movement. It is their bravery to resist against what I guess the status quo is saying that has led to the change, and we today feel the benefits of that. So it's extremely powerful, and it's great to hear you say so. Jonathon, I'm getting this question a lot. You did, I guess, mention it a little bit, but Richard, Dominic have all been asking, maybe at the end of this year then, will Jonathon join us on a march?
You can see my direction of travel. I'm hoping that next week I will be an observer on marches. I want to help with leafleting and do that kind of stuff and help in whatever way I can. I think my principal role at the moment is to add my voice to the advocacy that Just Stop Oil is bringing forward, not uncritically, as you know. I have some serious reservations about some of Just Stop Oil's tactics. That's inevitable, but I think I can be useful in that respect, coming from a long 5 decades sort of lifetime in this cause. And then next year is next year. I know where I'm going on this, but I'm sort of still feeling my way. You can tell I'm still using a few political arts here and saying, I don't know, but the likelihood is, well, guess what?
There, I will take that. We can read the subtext. We'll read the subtext. One final question that's just come in, and I think as we've just been, the topic tonight is intergenerational justice. I think it's a really beautiful question from Stephanie. How do we teach future generations to take care and responsibility towards climate change?
I was looking again at a wonderful book by a man, Richard Louv, an American author who wrote The Last Child in the Woods, and it's a beautiful book about what we've done to deprive children of access to the natural world and access to all the beauty and awe and curiosity and urge to investigate that children might once have been able to have, and now it gets harder and harder for all sorts of different reasons. And he has a very simple premise. He says, you can't protect that which you don't love. And for you to love what needs to be protected, you have to be able to experience it and understand it. And I know that's a not direct answer about how do we help children, young people today to do that for climate, but in this respect, climate and nature are really one and the same thing. What the damage we're doing to nature is the exact parallel of the damage we're doing to the climate. In some ways, the climate is less tangible, harder for kids to wrap their heads around some of the ways in which these climate impacts arise in people's lives today. But nature is not intangible. It's right there. It's to be touched, felt, smelt, discovered, explored. engaged in. And one of the key things for me as 10 years as a teacher was to find ways of helping young people keep that contact with the natural world, or find that contact with the natural world. And through that, I believe an understanding of climate will inform everything that the rest of their lives lead on to.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for that incredible talk. So insightful, so informative as well. Thank you also to all of those amazing questions. I'm sorry we didn't get around to many. There's over 200 people on this call. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for hosting it. I've enjoyed it.
It's my pleasure. Our pleasure, our pleasure. And as we posted it in the chat, but please check out Jonathan's blog. Share it amongst friends, family, whoever. It's a really great read. I'm now going to be passing over to the amazing Alex, an honor to call my co-worker, my colleague, my fellow supporter of Just Stop Oil, who's going to speak to now a little bit about the strategy and the campaign that Just Stop Oil are running at the moment. So over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Bea. I am feeling incredibly nervous. I do talks like this for Just Stop Oil quite frequently. But right now, speaking next to Jonathan and with like 220 people in the room, my heart is pounding and my mouth is quite dry. So like bear with me if I have to chug some water as I go on here. So yeah, my name is Alex. I'm 25. I've been supporting and campaigning with Just Stop Oil for a little bit over a year now. And it's been a pretty wild ride. And again, I'm like astounded to be sitting here talking next to someone like Jonathon Porritt. A year ago, I was about to graduate from my law program, and I basically found out about a talk very much like this, but with a tenth of the people. And I decided to go. And I didn't hear any new information. Like Jonathan said earlier, pretty much everyone in this call is likely interested in these kinds of things, has come across a lot of the horrifying weight of the statistical evidence before about the climate crisis, but the way it was presented was different, and the kind of driving intensity to it. And finally, there was a call to action at the end of it. And the call was basically, why don't you look at these facts in the face, in the eyes, straight on, and react to it? You know, like react rationally to what the experts are telling us, which is that essentially we're a couple decades away from potentially complete societal collapse, the deaths of billions of people, the largest migrant crisis in human history, dwarfing things like the Syrian refugee crisis of 7 million people. This could be hundreds of millions of people. I'm not going to repeat, a laundry list of climate facts because Jonathan has gone over the science in like a subtlety and a depth I couldn't. There's one paper that sticks out to me when I initially did research for these kind of things. It's from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and it's called the Human Niche paper. So I'm going to tell you about it really quickly. Humans, like any other animal, do have an ecological niche. And most people on the planet happen to live in this kind of band, this climate band, in this niche. And when we hit 3 degrees, which could be 2070 through 2100, the quantity of land on the planet, which is so hot and the conditions are so unbearable, it's practically unlivable, could balloon by something like 20x. And a lot of that land is going to be in the human niche. And this could displace, billions of people. It's difficult to wake up every day and like have that as the billboard to your day, right? The start of your day. Oh yeah, what's the thing you're working on? Oh yeah, billions of people in the next century, and it's a remarkable situation we're in. I'll just say that it's potentially, I would argue, it's unique in human history to have such a horrific historical event that's on the horizon and has been predicted decade by decade by the gold standard of experts, by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, by these panels, which are composed of scientists from all over the planet, year after year, published, available, visible. this is coming, this is coming, this is coming. And so I did end up getting this law degree. And I would very much right now like to be practicing or on my way to doing that. It's a passion of mine, arguing with people. And I'm not doing that, and I've decided to take some risks and maybe make a few sacrifices and do a bit of arrestable protest this year and some campaigning, something I'm not super comfortable with. And the reason for that is because I've come to realize this is it. This is the generation. For decades, this thing has been fobbed off. And it is tragic because it could have been prevented. Like Jonathon says, oil companies have been suppressing this information from the beginning. I'm going to move on and tell you a little bit about nonviolent direct action, civil disobedience, protest, and the heritage of these kind of actions which have driven political change throughout history. But before I do that, I want to add a little bit to, you see the dry mouth, right? I want to add a little bit to the corporate history that Jonathon already started to outline with saying that Exxon, which he very rightly said, has suppressed that information. Because corporations have done something else actually to suppress political dissent on the climate crisis, something actually a lot more subtle than just a blanket suppression. It's kind of genius actually what they did. The playbook for what they did began in the 50s. Beer and soda companies started creating all this plastic packaging. It was ended up, littered all over these environments. Regulators started to get on their tail. There was a bill that was passed in 53 in Vermont. So they hired some marketers and they put together a genius plan. They created a campaign and an organization, and it was called Keep America Beautiful. The tagline of this campaign was people start pollution, people can stop it. And so the upshot of this whole thing, and they ran ads, these guilt trippy ads. And the whole thing is basically, oh yeah, we produce millions of these cans and we're making billions of dollars, but it's your fault because you really shouldn't have thrown it out the window. And really, we wouldn't like to have to be forced by regulators to develop better packaging or get taxed on that. So we're going to convince you it's all on you, right? That's a good move, right? Shift the blame. But it's actually relatively unsophisticated compared to the second impact of these campaigns. Because again, in 2000, they took this playbook and resuscitated it, and it was resuscitated by a company called British Petroleum, you might have heard of. And in 2000, they hired a marketing firm, Ogilvy and Mather, and by 2004, they cooked up the carbon footprint. And I was taught the carbon footprint in school as a kid, and my whole generation was. The basic idea is very simple. We all have a consumer footprint, and that is the driver of the climate crisis, our consumer footprint. And if only you took a little bit of a shorter shower and you replaced your straws and you went with fluorescence, this wouldn't have happened, buddy. Don't look over here while we're still pulling millions of barrels out of the ground and every week we're developing a new field. Don't look at Rosebank, right? Because really you should consume a little less. And that's fine. That's fairly innocuous. Here's the upshot of this whole thing. That playbook that they have indoctrinated people with for decades. Not just that it's your fault, but that the only way that you can make a difference on the climate crisis is with your consumer dollar and what you do in the grocery store. Jonathon talked about this difference between people that, are going to stand up or let this thing roll by and be a bystander. And this is really what it's all about, because these campaigns have relied on this idea of social responsibility. And they say social responsibility is something you get when you walk into the grocery store. It alights, right? And when you walk back out into the parking lot, it extinguishes again. And in Just Stop Oil and in campaigns like it, civil resistance and civil disobedience campaigns, we have an alternative thesis, which is that you have social responsibility all of the time. And you don't just have it in the grocery store and the ballot box. So what does that mean? How does someone make a difference if it isn't just what they buy or who they vote for? It turns out there is a whole heritage of civil disobedience and protest. And we just have to dust it off. And it's pretty goddamn powerful. If you look at pretty much every movement throughout history that's won all of the rights that we cherish, right? Things as innocuous as child labor laws or the weekend, right? Nonviolent civil disobedience and protest are pretty much a part of every single one. I don't mean to make this sound too reductive or simple, and I'm sure there are people on here that are, maybe even like PhDs in this topic. But the good thing is, a lot like there are dynamics and systems and a logic to the climate crisis and climate breakdown, things like tipping points and nonlinear returns. All of that exists in social dynamics and politics. And it is studied. There are people like Tim Lenton in the UK and Exeter who are studying social tipping points and identify nonviolent direct action as literally one of the strongest drivers for them. I'm going to give you guys an example. Maybe one or two, not too many. A couple weeks ago in the Netherlands, 9,000 people were arrested blocking the A12 road that leads into The Hague. Now, is the Netherlands the UK? And no. And do we have the exact same situation here where the M25 leads right into Parliament? No, right? So there are a couple differences. But really, there's a lot of similarities as well, right? The lower house of the Netherlands, following these actions, is now deliberating how to completely phase out new licenses and consents for fossil fuels. They have won a landmark victory for the climate. And they did it by being transgressive. And they did it by using civil resistance, protest, and nonviolent action, right? I'll give you another quick example from a couple decades ago. In 1998, a couple students got together in Serbia, and by 2000, they'd overthrown a dictator. Now, this guy, Milosevic, had control of, the army and the jail cells and the tanks and the guns and everything else, right? At the height of their movement, at the kind of demonstration which finally ousted the regime, they had 70,000 people mobilized. That is a lot of people. Effectively 1% of the Serbian population. But if I had told you that 1% of the Serbian population could have ousted their violent dictator, right, that would actually be a pretty incredible achievement. And furthermore, they did it non-violently. They did face down these tanks and these guns and these jail cells, and they did it non-violently. Now, that's not a coincidence, it's a feature. They were inspired by a guy named Gene Sharp, who wrote a seminal work on nonviolent action called The Politics, what was it? I'm a bit nervous, I'm forgetting. Politics and Nonviolent Action, Google him, Gene Sharp. He drilled down the effectiveness and the kind of mechanism for nonviolent action into a single thing, I just want to leave you with this because I think it's inspiring, and I urge you to look more up about it later. But regimes, governments, all these baddies in charge, right? There's a game being played. They want to make their power seem what Gene Sharp called monolithic, meaning it just arises out of itself. It's something you could just bang your head against and never get through. The government just has too much on its side, right? Sharp argued that there's a basic fundamental currency of that power, a substrate, and it is obedience. Because if someone doesn't fire the guns and operate the tanks and close the jail cell, you've got nothing. And if the millions of people in the general population don't obey your commands, you've got nothing. And here's the good news. You don't need to take on the state physically. You can literally just take on the narrative of obedience. And that's why a couple thousand people in the Netherlands can win a landmark victory for the climate. And it's why 1% of the population could oust a dictator. And it is why Just Stop Oil has an equivalent like media buy of hundreds, like billions of dollars, right? Compared to the paltry spend, So if I'm getting across to you one thing, it's that we all have an incredible latent power. If we band together and we kind of throw out all of this corporate individualist programming, there is a tradition and a history stretching hundreds of years back of people overcoming massive odds. And Just Stop Oil is, for better or for worse, a part of that tradition. And a lot of brave people have been trying out a lot of different things in the past 2 years. And there have been some incredible actions. And in April, people went to the oil terminal, some really brave activists, and literally stopped the flow of fuel, costing oil companies millions of pounds. And then in the following October, people escalated and went to Westminster and occupied and glued themselves and fixed themselves to the roads and wouldn't leave till they were dragged off. And some brave people went to rugby games and cricket pitches or whatever you call it, and threw soup on the glass covering on the Van Gogh. And then in the last phase, people were slow marching in London for 13 weeks straight, going out time after time and challenging the state. And there have been some results. For one thing, the S&P is acceded to the demand, and so have labor. We don't trust them necessarily to follow through, which is why we have to hold everyone's feet to the fire, and we have to keep pushing. And Just Stop Oil is not going away till this gets done. And so Just Stop Oil is going back out again right now. If you are new to the campaign, if you are new to this kind of thing, you are watching this talk at a pretty opportune time. If you had come to one of these talks a couple weeks ago, a couple months ago, you would have had to wait if you're interested in protest. But luckily for you, there's a fire sale. It's going on right now. We can't get rid of it fast enough. So if you want to join us out on the road, we're going to give you details later on to do that if you'd like. We'd really appreciate it. I do want to give a quick caveat. We do advocate for this form of, again, transgressive, nonviolent civil disobedience and protest, which often involves arrest. But that doesn't mean arrest is right for everyone, and we really want to make that like a very clear distinction. Depending on where you're at in your life, there can be all kinds of factors that come into it. And actually, when I joined the campaign, I didn't think I was going to be arrested at all because I wanted to be a lawyer and I thought it'd be too risky and this kind of thing. And I made the decision I made, but everyone has to make this decision for yourselves. We also need to acknowledge that the cops are racist and ableist. The court system is terrible, and there's lots of factors that come into play. There's loads of ways to help the campaign and get involved. We're going to go into them in a bit, but to sort of lay them out for you so you can have them in your mind. People that are helping the campaign are doing a few things. People are now the sales pitch, right? People are donating. It's massive. Without donations, literally this doesn't happen. People are volunteering. There are loads of different ways to volunteer, make phone calls, help out with court support, police station support, supporting activists who are going to the cells or going to the courts and making sure they have, a warm, friendly face to look at when they get out. People are going to nonviolence trainings, and a pretty incredible offering. It's something that a lot of campaigns have had in the past. For example, ours has a lot of similarities with, I guess I'm a bit nervous because of the Freedom Riders. Jesus. The Freedom Riders campaign from the civil rights in the US. There's basically two main sections. The first is you discuss nonviolence with the people in the group. It's very collaborative. It gets very in depth. The second is people do exercises to help prepare their nervous system for what it might be like to be out on the road and have to maintain a nonviolent container, which is, again, like an essential element of this whole thing. So that includes like visualizations and on and on. You can go to these and you don't have to, you can bring a friend. It's open, it's up on the website, and we'll share resources for that later on. The last thing that's going on right now is there are people marching, slow marching for all of our futures. And from the 20th, people are going to be marching every day from Trafalgar Square at 12 p.m. So we'll be getting more information on that in a bit. So just, you can have these things in your mind, and later on we'll give you more info. Sorry if I've been going on a bit long. I really appreciate everyone. I might share one last thing if that's okay. Just an update on where we're at. So we're in the third week of action. There have been 467 brave people who've been arrested. Of those people, 153 have been held for court. 3 of them are now held in prison on remand, meaning before they've even, been to court, right? So we need to come out and support them. The system is straining under the weight of all of us who are not going to just sit down and lay down and let them steamroll over us and our futures and future generations and our, cousins and our kids and whoever else. And we really appreciate someone like Jonathon, the fact that you said you were trying to put yourself in the mind of an 18-year-old, 20-year-old, or 25-year-old, It is scary. It is scary to have this weird tension between you think you've got this idea for your life, and then actually you've got this horrific image as well, and how to integrate them, you know. So we're not going away, and we're not going to go down quietly. And lastly, they need to investigate the real criminals, the people that have been hiding this thing from us, this thing that will cause the deaths of billions of people, the people that have been trying to suppress this for decades and decades and decades. Enough for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alex. Amazing, amazing. Thank you, brother. I think that was incredible. I was hooked, even though I've heard this spiel before. I was completely hooked every time you speak. So thank you so, so much. The polls and the actions, the pathways to action that Alex is talking about, we'll do that poll in about 5-ish minutes. But before we do that, we're going to hear from a truly inspiring person and a personal testimony from one of our supporters, Rebecca. Rebecca Stonehill lives in Norfolk and is a writer and a teacher, and joined Just Stop Oil earlier this year and has taken a few actions. So thank you so much for joining us, Rebecca. Over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me on this evening. Yeah, so as Bea said, I've been part of Just Stop Oil since the beginning of this year. I'm 46 years old, writer and a teacher, and mum to 3 truly amazing teenagers. So when my husband and I decided to have kids, we knew that, so this is about 18 years ago, we knew that we had a duty of care to protect them. And earlier in this year, my eldest daughter, who's called Maya, and she's 17, she asked me, well, how can she be protected when facing the increasing threat of climate breakdown? And I didn't really have an answer for her. So what happened was I started to think more along the lines of not just worrying and talking about the climate and ecological emergency, but actually doing something and taking part in a movement that is seeking to address it. So yeah, there's some sobering facts that by 2050, my daughter Maya will be roughly the age that I am now. And according to leading global scientists in the IPCC report, which I know you'll all be familiar with, by then we are going to have far exceeded the safe upper limit of 1.5 degrees. Far more likely we're going to be at 2 degrees, and about 1.2 billion people will have been displaced from their homes. So I often wonder, is Maya going to be one of them? And how about my other 2 children? And how about all of the young people that you know and love? So I really believe that each generation is given 2 things. Firstly, they're given the gift of this incredible, living, breathing world. And secondly, the duty to keep it safe. And I'm afraid this contract has been broken, and it's happened on our watch. So that's the not so great news, but there is good news. When I joined Just Stop Oil earlier this year, really encouraged by my daughter, I found that being part of a movement of people who are, I like to think of it as the 3 C's, committed, courageous, and compassionate, I found that my anxiety has really decreased as I'm no longer a bystander. I really like what Jonathon said, actually. He talked about it as being upstanders. I'm now an upstander. I'm no longer a bystander. I've been arrested 3 times this year for slow marching. And during this recent phase at the beginning of the month, I was non-compliant on the roadside with the police. None of this is easy. I have really found this challenging, but I do believe it's working. I really believe that the police and the judiciary are at breaking point, and something is going to give soon. And like so many of us, we're inspired by the example over in the Netherlands, and there is strength in numbers. So I'd like to share a poem with you that I wrote in custody at the beginning of the month, which expresses, well, I think my grief around all of this, but also you'll see the trust and hope I have in this movement. Let me just bring it up. It's called Lessons in Weariness. And if you don't catch all of it, I will also paste a link in the chat. So here we go, lessons in weariness. As I lie on my back at the edge of Parliament Square, I stare up at the canopy of plane tree leaves above me and the clouds grazing the sky. And I don't feel fear or anger or any of those things I've felt before. This time, I just feel weary of it all. Weary that no matter what we do, those in their ivory towers will keep ripping up the rule book of morality and decency and carelessly tossing it into the fire. Weary of the slow marching. Weary of the knowledge that our courage could light every candle that burns, but our bodies are too few. Weary of the apathy, the lack of integrity, the "you're so brave, but I could never do that," the passive-aggressive commentary, the averted gaze and swift change of subject. Weary of the way my country helps to fuel wars, waving hands that drip with blood, while simultaneously strutting, proud as a peacock, to show how civilized we are, how democratic, a beacon for the rest of the world. Bone weary of the lies, of the harm. There are several officers surrounding me, urging me to get up and walk to the van. You could be injured, you know, if we tried to carry you. But how do I tell them I'm weary of their complicity and they're already hurting me without laying a finger on me? That they have a role to play, and this could be a beautiful opportunity if they'd only mind their moral courage. So I just shake my head and say I'm not moving. I'm lugged into a van like a 10-kilo sack of potatoes, and later I lie on a thin plastic mattress beneath a blue blanket for the third time this year, blinking up at a sign stamped onto the ceiling stating, "Criminals beware." And the weariness that I am being locked in a police cell for wanting to protect my children threatens to engulf me, while somewhere in the same city, the real criminals sit cloistered with their canapes and champagne. 2 hours in, and I haul my weariness up from the mattress to place my call. And the kindness of the words from this woman from back office I've never met, and probably never will, floors me, shakes me out like a tree shedding her leaves. "Thank you for your courage," she says. "Thank you for what you're doing." But I don't feel brave. And when I leave the call, the tears come, and I weep for those in Palestine, for those whose homes and lives are lost to flood and wildfire, for the creatures of the earth, sky, and sea whose numbers plummet, for the uncertain terrain today's children inherit. But most of all, I cry for the surprising, disarming nature of kindness, and I wonder, how can we turn this into a revolution? How can we infiltrate the drafty corridors of Whitehall with the warmth of kindness? How can we infuse the bones of those who grow heavy with the weight of their own glowing importance with tenderness and care? How can we get them to lie on their backs in Parliament Square or any patch of land generous enough to hold them and gaze up at each tree, each bird, and each leaf printed like miracles against the sky, as they did when they were children? How can we get them to feel, to know, to understand, to truly breathe in how much we will lose? The flap opens. "Are you okay?" the station officer asks. Perhaps he can see I've been crying. He brings me a coffee and asks what I'm writing in my notebook, if it's going to be a bestseller. "I'm writing about you," I say. "No, really?" I nod. "But why?" he asks. I pause, hear the steady hum of the room, and wonder about all the people who have sat on this narrow blue mattress before me, and how no doubt kindness has eluded them again and again. "I'm writing about my sadness," I finally say, "and I'm writing about kindness, about you being kind." And now it's his turn to be disarmed, his face suddenly naked and confused before he smiles uncertainly, closes the flap. I sit on the bed, watch the light from outside grow dim, sip black coffee, and think that perhaps this is all we have left, that we must disarm the world and all those who seek to stamp it down with kindness, that we must pass this chain of compassion like prayer beads from one to another, whispers from the future that enclose us in their embrace, that say, I know you are weary. I know this is hard, but you cannot see what we are looking at. So I catch these whispers, hold my fist tight around them, and when I am released from my cell, I fling these voices to the darkness and watch as the night receives them one by one, lighting up the sky in a beautiful, blazing rebellion, seeded from weariness, from tears, and from the courage of a multitude of tender, beating hearts. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Wow. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for sharing that. I remember Rebecca sent me that, I think the evening, the evening after you were released. It's so moving, so powerful. And a thank you again to everybody who has joined us this evening. Thank you so much to Jonathon for such clear, concise, informative talk. Thank you so much to Alex as well. Really, really inspired, and also to Rebecca for sharing as well. And thank you everyone who's in the chat. I'm seeing so many amazing comments. Fantastic poem, Rebecca. So thank you. Just the takeaway again from this evening, we've been talking about intergenerational justice, intergenerational responsibility. We're talking about now, and we're talking about where we go forward. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? How are you going to join and try and make a difference and try and fight for ourselves, for our future, but also the future of children, grandchildren, Rebecca's children, future children that I may or may not have? What are we going to do? And I really hope that people sit with that and reflect on that. So in line with that, we're going to do a poll now. And we're going to launch it. And please just take 1 second. It'll take 1 second just to fill it out. It's ways that you can get involved. It will really allow us to direct you to the right people, to the right group as quickly as possible. The ways you can get involved: donating is the lifeblood of a movement like this. It's really, really essential to continue this fight so that we can keep going out on the streets. Volunteering as well. Invaluable are volunteers. They really help with leafleting, with the ringing team, setting up meetings, regional meetings. It's so important that we have such a great body of support. We can also join us in marching. And you can start, as Alex said, you can start marching immediately. From Trafalgar Square, we leave at 12 p.m. You can join us from November 20th onwards, so next Monday, up to the next 2 weeks. Please join us. And it's a great way to meet people as well, and to feel that solidarity, to feel that community as well, which is really important in this fight, to not feel alone in it. And you can also join a non-violence training. And the non-violence training, we are a non-violent civil disobedience group. We are not aggressive, we are not hostile, and the non-violence trainings, again, a great place to meet people, also to get a feel of what it's like to go out on the roads, to march, and to get to know people.